take a look at Abandonment of Autos by Bruce Dawe. So before we start even looking closely at this poem, I just want to make it clear that the overall idea of this poem distinctly contrasts the tone and perspective and message from Enter Without So Much as Knocking. So this poem has a very different tone, it has a very different perception of the world, and the persona in this poem is definitely more sincere rather than looking very with a cynical perspective or very critical. So what we need to look at first of all is the title, so Abandonment of Autos. So the use of the word abandonment is really referencing this idea of consumer culture. So the idea that we are a throwaway society, that if something no longer works, if we no longer have use for something, we will just throw it away, rather than maybe finding a different purpose, repairing, fixing, those kind of things. So it's really suggesting how the world is very much influenced by consumer culture. And so from the title, we might consider that this is just going to be another example of people, participating in that throwaway society. And the abandonment of autos is really making reference to the American influence. So we call them cars in Australia, but we know that the automobile was a very Americanized term, and so it's Dawe's way of kind of bringing in that influence. And we will talk a little bit more about the influence of America as we go on through other poems. So we also start with this epigraph. So the city council is reported to be concerned about the number of old cars being abandoned in city streets. News item. So we get this little insight into the world. So the city council, so the local council, they're worried about the number of cars that are just being abandoned. Okay. Now, obviously, there's like a flow-on effect. We can understand that if cars are just being abandoned, then there's some kind of, responsibility from the council to move them or find out who owns them, all that kind of stuff. And we can see this is just from a news article by the use of the capitalized news item. And that really is just trying to, again, get the reader to be thinking along the lines of the persona in the poem. So it really helps to, as an audience, think, okay, that's an interesting thought. And what we then get to see is the persona's response to that article. So that reflective kind of thought about this point. Okay, now the other point I would like to make before we look more closely is this idea of it being quite a romantic view of human nature. Now, when I talk about romantic, I'm not necessarily talking about romance and love. I'm talking about a period of art and literature that was called romanticism, and that was in the 18th century. Now, this particular period and this particular time, anything within literature and arts really kind of emphasized being subjective. And that means that it was the personal mind and the personal thoughts that were reflected within the writing or reflected within the artworks as opposed to the outside world. So it was really enforcing the individual and individual thoughts, individual ideas, being different, looking at things from an alternate perspective. And it was very much celebrated, and it has continued in some ways throughout society and different culture, but it very much was a very new and interesting way of exploring the world and exploring art and literature, as opposed to everything that had been produced before that time. So this is taking this point where the persona in this poem is going to be looking from their own individual perspective. And if we think back to the previous poem, Enter Without So Much as Knocking, we know that the persona in that poem is all about fitting in, all about conforming, making sure that they're doing, thinking about themselves, not really caring about other people, not really thinking about the consequence of actions, just really trying to conform and make sure that they fit in within everything that is going on. Okay, so let's get started on looking at the poem. So we start off with this, kind of whimsical opening. So we can see that there's obviously the title, there's a lack of capital letters, and you can also note as you read through a lack of punctuation. So I'm going to read the first little part and then we'll talk about it. So something about the idea appeals to me immensely. The driver pulling up in some busy street after maneuvering dexterously for a parking spot, applying the handbrake, stepping out and closing the car door for the last time with grave tenderness. So this is first talking about someone who is going to just abandon their car. And the persona is saying that it appeals to them. It appeals to me. So we're getting that personal pronoun. We're getting that personal thought. This isn't about anyone else. This is about this person and what they might do. And they're finding it quite appealing to abandon their car on the street. So we have references here after maneuvering dexterously. And we really get that idea that they, they're in tune with the car. They know what they're doing. They can make all these maneuvers, and we think about parking and how that can cause some people difficulty. So we're getting this sense that this person has a really strong connection to their car. They found their parking spot, applying the handbrake, stepping out and closing the car door for the last time with grave tenderness. So this idea that they're going to be abandoning this car, yet they're closing the door with tenderness, like they're still taking care of this car. So, it's quite sincere and it's quite a personal thought, this idea of kind of moving on from the car. And if we think about even society, there is different ways people perceive cars. People might perceive them just as, a mere vehicle from getting from one place to another. We know that some people have an obsession about cars. They, will look after them, they will care for them and, treat them in a very special way. So we can see that these possessions, a car is a materialistic possession, but they can have this greater meaning than just being something that somebody owns. There can be this love towards a car, which, is quite an interesting concept, considering a car really is, an inanimate object. Okay. And we see here that, this is all in the present tense. This persona is really thinking about how this would actually take place. So really talking about that separation with the car. Then it moves on. In place of the customary abject submission to the cold appraisal of the merchant, for whom an old heap is only an inventory of parts, working and non-working. There in this seemingly casual walking away from the parked car, who is to know that he will not return? So what they're saying is just to abandon, just to step away from the car, is going to remove that point of going to a car dealer. So in place of the customary, so what traditionally or what typically people would do, where you take your car and then it's going to be appraised. So the cold appraisal. So there's really that kind of negative mood or tone in that point that they're going to not really be very nice about this. And we kind of have this idea that if someone's going to buy a secondhand car or a secondhand car dealer, they're going to try and rip you off. They're going to be a little bit dodgy. And this car isn't going to have that same value. If this person who owns their car loves their car, it's a treasured possession, and then this merchant's just going to go, this is just an old heap. This works, this doesn't work. That's really not the same way that the persona is actually caring for that car. So we're seeing this difference between being able to just throw something away and it having some kind of value. So, and who is to know that he will return? So that rhetorical question is really kind of, again, looking at that whimsy of that moment, that someone is just going to close the car door, walk off, and never return. Okay, but no one knows that. No one is really going to understand that. It will just look like someone who's parking a car and then walking away. So let's continue. A largeness of gesture, satisfaction of a sense of gallantry in the circumstances where sharp-faced men are forever lifting the bonnet with a frown, disdainfully kicking the tyres, discovering a leak in the radiator, and offering, in consequence, next to nothing. So we start to see here this bit of literary allusion, okay? A largeness of gesture, satisfaction of a sense of gallantry. So what the persona is saying is that they're being very noble, being very courageous, being very respectful of this vehicle, in that they're not going to put it through that process of being judged by the sharp-faced men and the merchant. So we're getting this symbolism that these men and the merchants aren't, a really good thing. So, they're forever lifting the bonnet with a frown, disdainfully kicking tires, discovering a leak in the radiator, and offering, in consequence, next to nothing. So the idea of being gallant is really, it originates from, knights and the medieval times, and that sense that a knight is going to be behaving in a very gallant way. So this is in contrast to the merchants who are going to be trying to rip people off and going to be a bit sly and untruthful. They're looking for the problems in the car. They're going to be going, oh, not sure about this. These tires, they're not quite right. And really making those judgments. And realistically, in all that this car has offered, in all that this car has provided, they're going to give them this money that really is next to nothing. Okay? And we need to see that hyperbole there, that there is no kind of monetary equivalent that's going to really satisfy the place that this car has provided. Okay? And, we get this idea that this isn't just something reckless. This isn't just someone going and abandoning a car because they're, taking risks, or they're trying to, go against society. This is someone who's thinking, well, I don't really want my car to have to go through that process. And so they're kind of thinking, well, this is why all these cars are being abandoned, is because people are kind of stuck. So it is the urban Arab's farewell to his steed, down to the final affectionate pat on the near mudguard before turning away, to shoulder a passage through the indifferent crowds, made free in the moment of loss, the one true test, only the license plate which he carries with him into the new life, stating clearly, as any letter of recommendation, here is one who senses the fitness of things. So we again move back to this metaphorical allusion. So this idea, the Arab's farewell to his steed. So it's really, again, talking about these old-fashioned historical ways that people would appreciate what they had. So the idea of a knight or a soldier or someone of that importance, their horse that they're going to be riding on, their steed, is of significant value to them. It is important to them. There is a bond and a connection between the knight and their horse. So, in the same way, this persona is going to give a final affectionate pat, just touching the car before sending it off on the near mudguard, before turning away. So there's that final affectionate pat, and we need to talk about that affectionate pat, because they're not just kind of slamming the door and walking off. There's kind of that appreciation, how you might, console something before you're going to be leaving for the last time. So then we move to this contrast where we start to see this difference between this person and the outside world. So to shoulder a passage through the indifferent crowds. So it's really saying that the people he's going to walk through, this mass of people, he has to shoulder a passage. He has to kind of make his way through. He's not just going to be able to glide through the crowd, and they're indifferent. They don't know what's happened. They don't know what he's just done. They're indifferent. Okay, so they're kind of not going to know. And so he's doing what is the most chivalrous, gallant action that he can think of in abandoning this car. But no one else would truly understand that. Okay, so, and he's kind of made free in the moment of loss. So because no one knows what he's doing, he's able to have that freedom of just walking through the crowd and no one really understanding. You know, if you were to go and take your car to get some kind of trade-in money for it, the people are going to be making judgments about that car. There's going to be that significant moment of the handover of the money and all those kind of things, letting go of the car, that this scene that's being depicted, we don't get that. And so the last little bit where we have this reference to the license plate, you know, carrying into the new life. This is really, again, this kind of romantic gesturing, you know, that they're not going to get the money, that all there really is this license plate holding this symbol of memory. So they've taken the license plate off, and that's going to be that connection. That's something that they've kept to keep that memory alive. It's not about the money. It's about, you know, the unselfish gesture of leaving this car. You know, they haven't wanted the money, so therefore they're not being selfish. And by taking the license plate and by walking away, it's like this letter of recommendation. Okay? Here is one who senses the fitness of things. So it's kind of showing that empathy. So here is one who senses the fitness of things. So rather than making those judgments about, you know, disdainfully kicking tires, the frown of, you know, the bonnet, leaks in the radiator, and offering next to nothing, the fact that they've just gone, you know what, I'm just going to abandon my car, I'm going to walk away, this is what it is, I don't need any money for this. And, you know, we have that connotation that there's more of an, you know, empathetic nature. And realistically, this is very idealistic. You know, we know that there's very few people that would probably just abandon their car if they knew they could probably get some money for it. And we certainly know that that kind of throwing away, we don't always like to do, especially if we think we can get some kind of money for it. And here I'm just talking generally about society. So, you know, the overall tone of this poem is providing a sense of hope, providing a sense that maybe there doesn't have to be this focus on, you know, the constraints of consumerism, that maybe there is some hope for humanity to break free of those constraints and maybe have that subjective nature, be able to be individual, you know, to have freedom of being individual in thought. So, you know, we do certainly see that. And the fact that there is a lot of enjambment in this poem, where we have this running along of the lines, it really takes away from any of those constraints as well, because it can be a little bit jarring in terms of the fact that these lines run on. But it does provide a bit of rhythm, and it does really connect and provide some kind of flow into the poem itself. The fact that we don't see the capitalization, the fact we don't see any of those harsh structures that were in Enter Without So Much as Knocking, really is evidence of that contrast. So we can see that Bruce Dawe, as much as he wants to show this impact of the consumer, he also wants to suggest that that isn't necessarily a true reflection of society as a whole, that we are capable of showing a sense of compassion. We are able to show empathy. We are able to participate in actions that aren't based around money or exchanges of services or goods or money and things like that. So it's really an interesting perspective. So obviously we will talk about this more in class, but hopefully this has given you an overview of what the poem is about in a general way.